Imagine being lost at sea with no GPS, no compass, nothing but endless water in every direction. One wrong turn, and you'd never see land again. For thousands of years, this was the nightmare every sailor faced. But a handful of brilliant minds changed everything. They cracked the code of the oceans, turned chaos into science, and gave humanity the power to conquer the seas. Today, I'm taking you on a journey through time to meet the men who taught the world to navigate. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're fascinated by history, science, and the brave souls who changed our world, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let me start by asking you something. When was the last time you got lost? Probably not recently, right? You pulled out your phone, opened Google Maps, and boom, problem solved. But strip away all that technology, and suddenly finding your way becomes one of the most challenging things a human can do. Now, multiply that difficulty by 1,000 and put yourself in the middle of an ocean. Early sailors faced a problem that seemed impossible to solve. The ocean looks the same in every direction. There are no landmarks, no roads, no signs pointing you toward home. The water stretches endlessly to the horizon, and one patch of blue looks exactly like every other patch of blue. So how did ancient mariners do it? How did they sail hundreds, even thousands of miles across open water and actually arrive where they intended? The answer lies in observation, patience, and an almost superhuman connection with nature. Early navigators became masters at reading the world around them. They didn't have instruments, they had their senses, their experience, and their courage. The sun was their first compass. Every morning, it rose in the east and set in the west. This wasn't rocket science, but it was reliable. Sailors could use the sun's position to determine the cardinal directions. At noon, when the sun was at its highest point, they knew they were looking due south in the northern hemisphere or due north in the southern hemisphere. It was basic, but it worked. Then there were the stars. On clear nights, the sky became a navigational map. In the northern hemisphere, sailors looked for Polaris, the North Star. This star sits almost directly above the North Pole and barely moves throughout the night. If you could see Polaris, you knew exactly which direction was north. The angle of Polaris above the horizon also told you something incredible: your latitude, your position north or south of the equator. In the southern hemisphere, where Polaris isn't visible, sailors used the Southern Cross constellation. By drawing an imaginary line through the long axis of the cross and extending it about 4.5 times its length, they could find the South Celestial Pole. But what about cloudy nights? What about storms when the stars were hidden for days or even weeks? That's when navigation became an art form. Sailors learned to read the ocean itself. The way waves moved, the color of the water, the types of birds they saw, all these things provided clues. Certain birds only fly within a specific distance from land. If you saw a tern, you knew land was probably within 30 to 50 miles. If you saw a gannet, land might be within 80 miles. Seabirds became flying signposts for desperate sailors. The color and temperature of the water told stories too. Shallow water near coastlines often appeared lighter in color than the deep blue of the open ocean. Changes in water temperature indicated different currents, and experienced sailors memorized these patterns like we memorize street names today. Even the smell of the air provided information. Land has a distinct smell: trees, vegetation, earth. Sailors with keen noses could sometimes smell land before they could see it, especially if they were approaching forested coastlines. These early navigators also paid attention to cloud formations. Certain types of clouds formed over land masses, and an experienced eye could spot these from miles away. Stationary clouds that didn't move with the wind often indicated an island or coastline beneath them. This type of navigation required incredible skill and years of experience. It wasn't something you could learn from a book. It was passed down from master to apprentice, from father to son, through countless voyages and often through tragic mistakes. Every successful journey added to humanity's collective knowledge of the sea. But this primitive navigation had serious limitations. It was imprecise, vulnerable to weather conditions, and incredibly dangerous. Countless ships were lost, thousands of sailors drowned, and entire expeditions vanished without a trace. Humanity needed something better, something more reliable, and slowly, civilization began to develop the tools and techniques that would revolutionize maritime navigation. Now let me introduce you to some of the first true masters of navigation, the Phoenicians. If you've never heard of them, don't worry. They're not as famous as the Greeks or Romans, but they should be. These people were the delivery drivers of the ancient world, and they turned maritime navigation into a professional science. The Phoenicians lived along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, in the area that's now Lebanon, around 1500 BC to 300 BC. They weren't great warriors, and they didn't build massive empires. What they did do was sail. Boy, did they sail. They turned the Mediterranean into their personal highway and established trade routes that connected the entire ancient world. What made the Phoenicians special wasn't just that they sailed. Lots of cultures did that. What made them exceptional was that they sailed farther, more consistently, and more successfully than anyone else. They developed techniques and technologies that became the foundation for all maritime navigation that followed. First, let me talk about their ships. Phoenician vessels were engineering marvels for their time. They built two main types of ships: the galley, powered primarily by oars with a sail for assistance, and the sailing ship, which relied mainly on wind power. Their trading vessels, called round ships, had wide hulls that could carry enormous amounts of cargo: wine, olive oil, textiles, timber, and their most famous export, purple dye made from murex snails. These ships were built from Lebanese cedar, a wood prized throughout the ancient world for its strength and resistance to rot. The Phoenicians understood shipbuilding at a level that wouldn't be matched for centuries. They knew how to waterproof hulls with pitch, how to design keels for stability, and how to rig sails to capture wind efficiently. But ships alone don't make great navigators. What really set the Phoenicians apart was their knowledge and their courage to venture beyond the sight of land. While most ancient sailors hugged coastlines, terrified of open water, the Phoenicians sailed straight across the Mediterranean. They established colonies in Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and even Spain. Their most famous colony, Carthage, became one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world. The Phoenicians were among the first to use the stars systematically for navigation. They paid particular attention to Ursa Minor, the Little Bear constellation, because it contained a star close to the celestial North Pole. Greek writers later called this the Phoenician star, in recognition of how the Phoenicians used it to navigate. They also created some of the earliest known sailing directions, called periplus. These were written guides that described coastlines, harbors, landmarks, distances between ports, and potential dangers. Imagine a combination of a guidebook, a map, and a captain's log, all rolled into one. These documents were closely guarded trade secrets, giving Phoenician sailors an enormous competitive advantage. The Phoenicians may have achieved something even more remarkable, though historians still debate it. Some ancient texts suggest that around 600 BC, Egyptian pharaoh Necho II hired Phoenician sailors to circumnavigate Africa. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, these sailors departed from the Red Sea, sailed south along the east coast of Africa, rounded the Cape, and returned through the Mediterranean after a 3-year journey. Many historians dismissed this story as fantasy for centuries, but here's what makes it credible. Herodotus included a detail he himself didn't believe. He wrote that the sailors claimed that as they sailed around Africa, the sun was on their right hand to the north. Herodotus thought this was ridiculous, but we know now that this is exactly what would happen if you sailed around southern Africa. you'd be in the southern hemisphere, where the sun does appear to the north at midday. That small, disbelieved detail might actually prove the journey happened. The Phoenicians may have circumnavigated Africa 2,000 years before European explorers claimed the achievement. Whether this incredible voyage actually occurred or not, it tells us something important. The Phoenicians had the ships, the skills, and the courage to attempt something that audacious. The Phoenician legacy extends far beyond their own civilization. They taught the Greeks, who taught the Romans, who taught medieval Europe. The navigational techniques they pioneered, using stars, creating maritime charts, establishing trade routes, building reliable ships, these became the foundation that all later navigation built upon. Without the Phoenicians, the age of exploration might have been delayed by centuries. They proved that humans could master the seas, that oceans were highways rather than barriers, and that with the right knowledge and tools, no destination was unreachable. While the Phoenicians were mastering the Mediterranean, on the other side of the world, another group of sailors was accomplishing something even more extraordinary. The Polynesian wayfinders navigated the largest ocean on Earth without any instruments whatsoever, settling thousands of islands across an area larger than Russia. This is navigation elevated to an art form so sophisticated that modern scientists are still trying to fully understand it. Let me give you some perspective on what the Polynesians achieved. Between about 1500 BC and 1200 AD, Polynesian navigators explored and settled islands scattered across the Pacific Ocean, an area spanning roughly 10 million square miles. They sailed from Southeast Asia to Easter Island, from Hawaii to New Zealand. These weren't short trips along coastlines. These were multi-thousand-mile voyages across open ocean to find islands that were mere specks in an endless expanse of water. How did they do it? The Polynesian navigational system, called wayfinding, is one of the most sophisticated, non-instrumental navigation methods ever developed. It integrated astronomy, meteorology, oceanography, and biology into a comprehensive system passed down through oral tradition from master navigators to apprentices. Polynesian navigators used what they called a star compass. This wasn't a physical instrument, but a mental map of the night sky. They memorized the rising and setting positions of dozens of stars throughout the year. Each star rose and set at a specific point on the horizon, creating a 360-degree compass around the navigator. By knowing which stars rose and set in which positions, a wayfinder could maintain a course with remarkable accuracy. But stars were just the beginning. Polynesian navigators read ocean swells with a precision that seems almost supernatural to us today. Ocean swells are different from local wind waves. They're long, regular undulations created by distant weather systems, and they travel across thousands of miles of open ocean with consistent direction and pattern. A skilled wayfinder could identify multiple swell systems moving through the same area simultaneously. They could feel these swells through the hull of their canoe, distinguish between them, and use them to maintain course even when stars were obscured by clouds. Some navigators could even detect how swells refracted, bent, around distant islands, using these disruptions in the swell pattern to detect land beyond the horizon. They also used wave patterns. When ocean swells encounter islands, they create complex interference patterns on the lee side, areas of calmer water, reflected waves, and disrupted patterns. Experienced navigators could read these patterns and determine the direction and approximate distance to land, even when the island itself was still beyond the horizon. Cloud formations provided another layer of information. Certain clouds formed over islands, particularly stationary clouds that hovered in one place while others moved with the wind. The color of clouds could also indicate land. Greenish tinges reflected from lagoons, lighter coloring from sand beaches. Polynesian navigators studied birds extensively, Different species had different ranges from land. Frigate birds, for example, don't land on water and must return to land each night, so seeing them in the afternoon told navigators that land was in the direction the birds were heading. Boobies and terns had different ranges and behaviors, each providing specific information. They even used biological clues like phosphorescence in the water, the presence of certain fish species, floating vegetation, and changes in water color and temperature. They noted everything, forgot nothing, and integrated all these observations into a complete navigational picture. Perhaps most impressive was their ability to create mental maps of entire ocean regions. Master navigators memorized sequences of islands, the distances between them, the star courses to sail from one to another, and the specific navigational challenges of each journey. This information existed entirely in memory and oral tradition, passed from one generation to the next through years of apprenticeship. When Europeans first encountered Polynesian navigators, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Captain James Cook sailed with a Tahitian navigator named Tupaia in 1769. Tupaia drew a map from memory showing the locations of 130 islands across an area spanning over 2,000 miles. Cook was astounded. Here was a man with no instruments, no charts, no written records, who possessed geographic knowledge that rivaled anything available to European navigators. Tragically, much of this knowledge was almost lost. As European colonization disrupted traditional Pacific cultures, the art of wayfinding nearly died out. By the mid-20th century, only a handful of traditional navigators remained, mostly in Micronesia and parts of Polynesia. Then, in the 1970s, a remarkable effort began to revive this ancient art. The Polynesian Voyaging Society built Hokulea, a traditional double-hulled voyaging canoe, and recruited Mau Piailug, a master navigator from Satawal in Micronesia, to teach the old ways. In 1976, Hokulea sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti using only traditional wayfinding techniques. No instruments, no GPS, just ancient knowledge and skill. The voyage was a complete success. Since then, Hokulea has completed multiple voyages around the Pacific and even circumnavigated the globe, always using traditional navigation. A new generation of wayfinders has learned the ancient art, ensuring that this incredible knowledge won't be lost. The Polynesian wayfinders remind us that there are multiple paths to mastery. The Europeans developed sophisticated instruments and mathematical techniques. The Polynesians developed an equally sophisticated system that required no instruments at all, just phenomenal observational skills, comprehensive knowledge, and the ability to read nature's subtle signs. Both approaches worked. Both allowed humans to conquer the oceans, and both deserve our respect and admiration. Now let's shift our focus to Europe and the development of navigational instruments. While the Polynesians were perfecting instrumental free navigation, European sailors were taking a different approach. They wanted tools, physical devices that could measure angles, calculate positions, and take the guesswork out of navigation. This brings us to one of the most important instruments in the history of navigation, the astrolabe. When I first learned about astrolabes, I was amazed that something that looks like a fancy brass disc could revolutionize navigation. But that's exactly what it did. The astrolabe wasn't originally designed for navigation. It was an astronomical instrument invented by ancient Greek astronomers, probably around 150 BC, and perfected by Islamic scholars during the medieval period. Astronomers used it to measure the altitude of celestial bodies above the horizon and to solve complex astronomical problems. The maritime astrolabe was a simplified version adapted specifically for use on ships. Here's how it worked. The instrument consisted of a circular brass disc with degree markings around its edge and a rotating arm called an alidade. A sailor would hang the astrolabe vertically, letting gravity ensure it was perfectly level. Then, looking through sights on the Alidade, the navigator would align it with a celestial body, usually the sun at noon or the North Star at night. Once aligned, the Alidade pointed to a degree marking on the disc's edge. This number represented the altitude of that celestial body above the horizon, measured in degrees. And here's why that mattered. The altitude of the North Star above the horizon directly corresponds to your latitude. If Polaris appeared 20 degrees above the horizon, you were at 20 degrees north latitude. It's that simple. For the first time in history, sailors could determine their precise north-south position without relying solely on dead reckoning. The process of estimating position based on speed, time, and direction traveled. This was revolutionary. Ships could now sail directly across oceans with confidence that they could maintain their latitude and reach their intended destination. The astrolabe had limitations, though. Using it on a rolling ship deck was challenging. The instrument needed to hang vertically, but ship motion made this difficult. Taking accurate readings required calm seas and a steady hand. The sun was easier to observe than stars because it was bright enough to see even when the astrolabe swayed. But looking at the sun created its own problems, including eye damage. This led to the development of the quadrant, another revolutionary instrument. The quadrant was simpler than the astrolabe, essentially a quarter circle of wood or metal with degree markings along the curved edge and a plumb bob hanging from the corner. Navigators would sight along one straight edge to a celestial body, while the plumb bob indicated the angle on the graduated arc. The cross staff, also called the Jacob's staff, was another innovation. This instrument consisted of a long staff with a sliding crosspiece. The navigator held one end to their eye, slid the crosspiece until it aligned with both the horizon and a celestial body, and then read the angle from markings on the staff. It was simpler to use than an astrolabe and worked well for measuring the sun's altitude. Later came the backstaff, invented by English navigator John Davis in 1594. This ingenious device allowed navigators to measure the sun's altitude without looking directly at it, solving the eye damage problem. The navigator stood with their back to the sun, aligning shadows and sights to measure the angle. It was safer and more accurate than previous methods. All these instruments had one thing in common. They allowed navigators to determine latitude with reasonable accuracy. This was huge. It meant that European sailors could now venture farther from land with greater confidence. They could sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and as long as they maintained their latitude, they'd eventually reach their destination. This instrumental approach to navigation became the foundation of the Age of Exploration. Spanish, Portuguese, English, Dutch, and French sailors carried these instruments aboard ships that explored the entire globe. The astrolabe, quadrant, and cross staff made possible Columbus's journey to the Americas, Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa to India, and Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe. But, and this is important, these instruments only solved half the navigation problem. They determined latitude, the north-south position. But longitude, the east-west position, remained a mystery. You could know exactly how far north or south you were, but you had no idea how far east or west you'd traveled. This limitation would plague navigation for centuries and lead to countless maritime disasters, but we'll get to that problem soon. First, I want to introduce you to a man who helped revolutionize European navigation in other ways. When most people think about famous explorers, they think of Columbus, Magellan, or Vasco da Gama. But there's one person who made all their achievements possible, even though he wasn't much of an explorer himself. His name was Prince Henry of Portugal, and history remembers him as Henry the Navigator. Here's the ironic part. Henry didn't actually sail on voyages of exploration. He didn't discover new lands or chart unknown waters. What he did was arguably more important. He created the world's first institution dedicated to the systematic study and advancement of maritime navigation. He turned exploration from a haphazard, luck-based endeavor into a scientific discipline. Prince Henry was born in 1394, the third son of King John I of Portugal. As a royal prince, he had resources but would never inherit the throne, so he dedicated himself to a different kind of power, the power of knowledge and exploration. Around 1418, he established a navigation school and research center at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. At Sagres, Henry gathered the best minds he could find: cartographers, astronomers, instrument makers, ship designers, and experienced sailors. He brought together Islamic scholars who knew about astronomy and mathematics, Jewish mathematicians who could calculate tables for navigation, Italian mapmakers who had the best cartographic techniques, and Portuguese sailors who had practical experience. This interdisciplinary approach was revolutionary. Before Henry, knowledge about navigation was scattered, often kept secret by individual sailors or trading companies. Henry created a place where knowledge was shared, tested, and improved. It was like an early version of a modern research university focused entirely on maritime science. The scholars at Sagres made several crucial advances. They improved the design of the astrolabe for maritime use, making it more practical aboard ships. They created detailed tables showing the sun's declination throughout the year, which sailors could use with their astrolabes to calculate latitude more accurately. They developed better charts that incorporated the latest geographic discoveries and corrected old errors. Henry also revolutionized ship design. Under his patronage, Portuguese shipbuilders developed the caravel, a new type of vessel that would become the workhorse of the age of exploration. The caravel was relatively small, but extremely maneuverable. It had a shallow draft, allowing it to explore coastal waters and rivers. Most importantly, it could sail effectively into the wind, something earlier ships couldn't do well. This ability to sail into the wind was crucial for exploration. Previous ships had to wait for favorable winds to return home, sometimes for months. The caravel could sail against the wind through a technique called tacking, zigzagging at angles to the wind direction. This gave explorers the freedom to venture farther, knowing they could return whenever they wanted. Henry's influence on exploration was profound. He organized and funded numerous expeditions down the west coast of Africa. Each expedition pushed a little farther south, mapping coastlines, establishing trading posts, and bringing back information. Year by year, Portuguese navigators extended European knowledge of Africa. These voyages faced enormous psychological barriers. Medieval Europeans believed the ocean south of Cape Bojador, on the coast of the Sahara, was boiling hot and full of sea monsters. They thought that any ship that sailed too far south would burn or be destroyed. For nearly 15 years, Henry's expeditions failed to pass Cape Bojador because sailors were too terrified to continue. Finally, in 1434, a captain named Gil Innes successfully rounded Cape Bojador and returned safely. The psychological barrier was broken. The ocean wasn't boiling. There were no monsters. The way was open for further exploration. Over the following decades, Portuguese explorers trained in Henry's methods and sailing his caravel designs pushed steadily southward. They reached Senegal, Guinea, Sierra Leone. They discovered the Cape Verde Islands and the Azores. They established profitable trade in gold, ivory, and unfortunately, enslaved people. Henry died in 1460, but his legacy continued. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. In 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa and reached India, establishing a sea route that would make Portugal one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. None of this would have happened without Henry the Navigator. He didn't sail the voyages, but he created the system, that made them possible. He proved that exploration could be organized, that knowledge could be systematically advanced, and that careful preparation could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Henry's approach, combining theoretical knowledge with practical experience, gathering experts from different fields, testing improvements, and persistently working toward long-term goals, became the model for all subsequent exploration and eventually for scientific research in general. He showed that the greatest discoveries don't always come from the people who get the glory, but from those who build the foundations that make glory possible. All right. Now we get to one of the most fascinating problems in the history of navigation, a problem so difficult that it stumped the greatest scientists of the age, caused countless maritime disasters, and killed thousands of sailors. This is the longitude problem, and its eventual solution is one of the most remarkable stories in scientific history. Remember how I said earlier that instruments like the astrolabe could determine latitude, but not longitude? Let me explain why longitude was such a nightmare to calculate. Determining latitude is relatively straightforward. Measure the angle of the North Star or the sun at noon above the horizon. Do some simple math, and you know how far north or south of the equator you are. But longitude, how far east or west you are, is fundamentally different. There's no celestial body that directly tells you your east-west position. Longitude is really a problem of time. The Earth rotates 360 degrees in 24 hours, which means it rotates 15 degrees every hour. If you know the time at two different locations simultaneously, you can calculate the longitudinal difference between them. Every hour of time difference equals 15 degrees of longitude. Here's an example. Suppose it's noon where you are. You know this because the sun is at its highest point in the sky. If you also know that at this same moment it's 3 p.m. in London, then you must be 45 degrees west of London, 3 hours times 15 degrees per hour. The problem is, how do you know what time it is in London when you're on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? This was the crux of the longitude problem. Sailors needed an accurate clock that kept London time throughout a voyage. But creating such a clock was almost impossibly difficult. Ships rock constantly. Temperatures change from freezing to tropical. Humidity varies wildly. Salt air corrodes metal. These conditions wreak havoc on mechanical clocks. The pendulum clocks used on land in the 1700s were useless at sea. The rocking motion made them completely unreliable. The inability to determine longitude caused disasters regularly. Ships missed their destinations by hundreds of miles. They ran aground on unexpected coastlines. They became lost, ran out of supplies, and crews died of starvation and scurvy. The worst disaster occurred in 1707 when 4 British warships wrecked on the Scilly Isles off the coast of Cornwall. Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel was leading a fleet returning from Gibraltar to England. His navigators miscalculated their position, thinking they had more sea room than they actually did. The fleet ran into rocks at night. 4 ships sank, and nearly 2,000 men died, including the admiral himself. This tragedy shocked Britain. It became devastatingly clear that the longitude problem wasn't just an academic puzzle, it was costing lives and threatening Britain's naval supremacy. Something had to be done. In 1714, the British Parliament passed the Longitude Act, establishing a prize of $20,000, equivalent to several $1 million today, for anyone who could devise a practical method of determining longitude at sea with an accuracy of half a degree. Additional smaller prizes were offered for less accurate but still useful methods. The Longitude Prize attracted attention from scientists, mathematicians, astronomers, inventors, and crackpots from across Europe. There were 2 main approaches to solving the problem. The first approach was astronomical. Astronomers proposed using predictable celestial events as a cosmic clock. The most promising method involved the moon. The moon moves relatively quickly against the background stars, and its position can be predicted with great accuracy. If you could measure the moon's position and compare it to tables predicting where it should be at specific times, you could determine the time at a reference location. This method, called the lunar distance method, was theoretically sound but practically difficult. It required extremely accurate measurements of the moon's position relative to stars or the sun, precise tables predicting lunar positions, and complex calculations. Doing all this on a rolling ship deck with period instruments was enormously challenging. Nevertheless, many astronomers believed this was the right approach. They thought the solution to longitude would come from astronomy and mathematics, not from mechanics and engineering. They were partially right. The lunar distance method eventually became a backup navigation technique, but it wasn't the breakthrough that would truly solve the longitude problem. That breakthrough would come from an unexpected source, a self-taught clockmaker from Yorkshire named John Harrison. And his story is so incredible that it deserves its own section. John Harrison was born in 1693 in Yorkshire, England. He was the son of a carpenter and received little formal education. By all accounts, he should have been a complete unknown, living a quiet life building wooden furniture. Instead, he became one of the most important inventors in history. Harrison was fascinated by clocks from childhood. He taught himself clockmaking, studied the mechanics of timekeeping, and experimented with different designs. By his 20s, he had developed a reputation as an exceptionally skilled clockmaker who could create timepieces of unusual accuracy. When Harrison learned about the Longitude Prize in his 30s, he became obsessed with solving it. While others pursued astronomical methods, Harrison had a different vision. He believed he could build a mechanical clock that would keep accurate time at sea, despite all the challenging conditions. This seemed almost impossible. Remember, clocks at this time used pendulums, which didn't work on ships. They used lubricating oils that thickened in cold and thinned in heat, affecting accuracy. They expanded and contracted with temperature changes, altering their timing. They corroded in salt air. No one had ever built a clock that could maintain accuracy within seconds over weeks or months under such conditions. Harrison didn't care about what seemed impossible. He spent years developing his first marine chronometer, which he called H1. He completed it in 1735 and presented it to the Board of Longitude in London. H1 was a magnificent machine, a complex assembly of brass wheels, springs, and balances weighing 75 pounds. Harrison had invented several revolutionary features. He eliminated the need for lubrication by using wooden components and rollers in key areas. He created a temperature compensation system using bimetallic strips that automatically adjusted as temperature changed. He designed a special balance mechanism that wasn't affected by ship motion. The Board of Longitude was impressed but skeptical. They arranged for H1 to be tested on a voyage to Lisbon. The clock performed remarkably well, but Harrison himself wasn't satisfied. He knew he could do better. Over the next decades, Harrison built 3 more chronometers: H2, completed in 1741, H3, which took him 19 years and was completed in 1759, and finally H4, a completely different design finished in 1761. H4 was Harrison's masterpiece and one of the most beautiful scientific instruments ever created. Unlike its predecessors, which were large and complex, H4 looked like an oversized pocket watch, just 5 inches in diameter. It was elegant, compact, and revolutionary. Harrison had miniaturized all his innovations into this small package. H4 used a special balance wheel that compensated for temperature changes. Its escapement, the mechanism that regulated the release of energy from the spring, was entirely new and far more accurate than anything previously designed. Every component was crafted with obsessive precision. In 1761, H4 was tested on a voyage to Jamaica. Harrison's son William accompanied the chronometer, carefully maintaining and monitoring it. The outbound journey took 81 days. During that time, H4 lost only 5 seconds. 5 seconds in 81 days. This translated to a longitude error of just 1¼ nautical miles, far better than the half-degree accuracy required for the full longitude prize. Harrison had done it. He had solved the unsolvable problem. A self-taught carpenter's son had accomplished what the greatest scientists and mathematicians of Europe had failed to achieve. But here's where the story gets frustrating. The Board of Longitude, dominated by astronomers who favored the lunar distance method, refused to award Harrison the full prize. They demanded more tests. They changed the rules. They questioned whether a clock was a valid solution to a problem they believed required an astronomical answer. Harrison was devastated and furious. He spent years fighting for recognition and his prize money. He built an even better version, H5, to prove his design was reproducible. He appealed to King George III himself, who was a science enthusiast, and became Harrison's ally. Finally, in 1773, when Harrison was 80 years old, Parliament awarded him a monetary settlement close to the original prize amount. It wasn't official recognition. The Board of Longitude never fully acknowledged his achievement during his lifetime, but it was something. Harrison died in 1776, just 3 years after finally receiving his reward. He had spent more than 40 years of his life perfecting marine chronometers, often working in poverty, facing dismissal and skepticism from the scientific establishment, but never giving up. His invention transformed maritime navigation. Within decades, British clockmakers were producing marine chronometers based on Harrison's designs. These instruments became standard equipment on naval and merchant vessels. Captain James Cook carried a copy of H4 on his second voyage to the Pacific and praised its accuracy. For the first time in history, ships could determine both their latitude and their longitude with precision. The marine chronometer was used for navigation until the late 20th century, when satellite technology finally replaced it. For over 200 years, Harrison's invention was the backbone of global navigation. John Harrison's story teaches us several powerful lessons. First, expertise can come from unexpected places. Harrison had no university education, no formal training in science, yet he solved a problem that stumped the most educated minds of his era. Second, persistence matters. Harrison faced decades of rejection, skepticism, and unfair treatment, but he never stopped working, never stopped improving his designs. Third, sometimes the practical engineer accomplishes what the theoretical scientist cannot. The astronomers were brilliant, but Harrison's hands-on, mechanical approach proved more effective for this particular problem. Harrison's marine chronometer stands as one of the most important inventions in human history. It made global navigation reliable, enabled accurate cartography, supported worldwide commerce, and strengthened naval power. It saved countless lives by preventing ships from getting lost. In a very real sense, Harrison's clocks helped create the modern interconnected world. Today, if you visit the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, London, you can see Harrison's chronometers on display. H1, H2, H3, H4, and H5 all sit in glass cases, still keeping time after more than 250 years. They're not just museum pieces. They're monuments to human ingenuity, perseverance, and the power of refusing to accept that something is impossible. Every time I think about Harrison's story, I'm reminded that the greatest breakthroughs often come from the most unlikely sources. The establishment said it couldn't be done. The experts pursued different solutions. But one man, working alone in his workshop, believed he could solve the unsolvable. And he did. Harrison's legacy extends far beyond navigation. He demonstrated that precision engineering could solve problems previously thought to require only theoretical mathematics. He showed that craftsmanship and mechanical intuition could be just as valuable as academic knowledge, and he proved that determination and self-belief could overcome institutional resistance and skepticism. The longitude problem was solved not by a committee of experts, not by a well-funded research institution, but by a stubborn, brilliant, self-taught clockmaker who refused to give up. That's the kind of story that gives me hope about human potential. Now let me bring you from Harrison's era to the modern day and show you how navigation evolved from mechanical precision to electronic magic that would have seemed like pure witchcraft to sailors just a century ago. After Harrison proved that mechanical chronometers could solve the longitude problem, maritime navigation entered what I call a golden age of precision. The sextant, invented in the mid-18th century around the same time Harrison was perfecting his chronometers, replaced earlier instruments like the astrolabe and quadrant. The sextant was a massive improvement. It could measure angles between celestial bodies and the horizon with unprecedented accuracy, down to 10 seconds of arc. That's incredibly precise. A skilled navigator with a sextant and a reliable chronometer could determine their position to within a mile or two, anywhere on Earth, at any time. This combination of technologies remained the absolute standard for ocean navigation for nearly 2 centuries. Every naval officer learned celestial navigation. It wasn't optional. It was an essential skill, practiced daily aboard ships around the world. The process became beautifully standardized and almost ritualistic. At dawn and dusk, during what navigators called nautical twilight, that magical time when both stars and the horizon were visible, navigators would take sightings of multiple stars. They'd carefully measure the angles with their sextant, note the exact time from their chronometer, and then spend the next hour working through complex mathematical calculations using specialized tables that filled entire books. They'd plot their position on a chart, compare it to their previous position, and determine the ship's course and speed. This was navigation, as both an art and a science combined. It required skill with delicate instruments, deep knowledge of mathematics, thorough understanding of astronomical principles, and careful attention to detail. A tiny mistake in reading the sextant, an error of just a few seconds in timing, or a miscalculation in the math could put a ship miles off course. But celestial navigation, as beautiful and reliable as it was, had some serious limitations. First, and most obviously, it required clear skies. You can't see stars through clouds or measure the sun's altitude in a storm. Second, it required a visible horizon, which meant it didn't work in fog, heavy weather, or even twilight conditions that weren't quite right. And third, it only provided position fixes a few times per day, not continuous information about where you were. The 20th century brought revolutionary changes that completely transformed navigation. Radio technology, which seems primitive to us now, but was absolutely cutting edge at the time, introduced radio direction finding in the early 1900s. Ships could receive radio signals from coastal stations and determine their direction to those stations. By taking bearings from multiple stations, they could triangulate their position. This was the first time in human history that ships could navigate accurately without looking at the sky. Weather didn't matter. Time of day didn't matter. It was revolutionary. During World War II, the military urgency to navigate accurately in all conditions led to several sophisticated radio navigation systems. The most important was LORAN, which stands for Long-Range Navigation. LORAN used synchronized radio signals from multiple transmitters. By measuring the tiny time differences between when each signal arrived, navigators could determine their position with remarkable accuracy. LORAN became widely used for both military and civilian navigation and remained in service until 2010. Yes, just 15 years ago. Some of you watching might remember using LORAN. Then came the space age, and with it, the ultimate solution to navigation: satellites orbiting above the atmosphere, looking down on the entire planet. The first satellite navigation system was called Transit, developed by the US Navy in the 1960s. The Navy had a specific problem. Submarines needed a way to determine their position accurately while remaining submerged, hidden from enemy detection. Transit provided this capability. Ships and submarines could receive signals from orbiting satellites and calculate their position. It wasn't continuous. You had to wait for a satellite to pass overhead, but it worked regardless of weather, time of day, or any other condition. Transit proved the concept and showed that space-based navigation was not only possible, but practical. But Transit was just the beginning. The real revolution came with GPS, the Global Positioning System. I want you to understand just how remarkable GPS is, because we've all become so accustomed to it that we don't appreciate the absolute miracle of technology we carry in our pockets. GPS was developed by the US Department of Defense starting in the 1970s and became fully operational in 1995. The system uses a constellation of at least 24 satellites orbiting Earth at an altitude of about 12,500 miles. These satellites are positioned so that at any time, from any location on Earth, you can receive signals from at least 4 satellites, usually more. Each satellite continuously broadcasts radio signals containing 2 crucial pieces of information: the satellite's precise position in space and the exact time from atomic clocks aboard the satellite. These atomic clocks are accurate to billionths of a second. They would take 300,000 years to gain or lose 1 second. Here's how your GPS receiver works. It receives signals from multiple satellites. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, so by calculating how long each signal took to reach you, the receiver determines your distance from each satellite. With signals from 4 or more satellites, the receiver can calculate your precise 3-dimensional position: latitude, longitude, and altitude, plus your velocity and the exact time. The accuracy is extraordinary and honestly kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Consumer GPS receivers, like the one in your phone that probably cost the manufacturer about $5, typically provide position accuracy within about 15 feet. 15 feet anywhere on Earth. Military GPS receivers, using encrypted signals that civilians can't access, can achieve accuracy within inches. And the system works anywhere on Earth, at any time, in any weather, day or night. Let me put this in perspective. For thousands of years, literally thousands of years, determining your position at sea was one of the hardest challenges humans faced. It required years of training, expensive instruments, clear weather, and constant vigilance. Brilliant minds struggled their entire lives with this problem. Thousands of ships were lost because they didn't know where they were. Today, a device smaller than a deck of cards, costing less than $100, tells you exactly where you are within seconds of turning it on. You don't need to understand astronomy. You don't need to know mathematics. You don't need to know anything about navigation techniques. You just turn it on. And it works. That's absolutely incredible. GPS has become so ubiquitous that we barely think about it anymore. It's in our phones, our cars, our watches, our fitness trackers. It guides aircraft through the sky, ships across oceans, and spacecraft to other planets. It enables precision agriculture, allowing farmers to plant crops with centimeter accuracy, saving fuel and fertilizer. It synchronizes time for financial transactions, power grids, and telecommunications networks. It enables ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft, package delivery tracking, and thousands of location-based apps that we use every day. But I have to tell you something important. GPS isn't perfect, and it's definitely not the end of the navigation story. GPS signals are relatively weak by the time they reach Earth's surface. They can be jammed or spoofed, tricked into giving false information. They don't work well indoors or underground. They can be disrupted by solar storms, and they depend on satellite infrastructure that could be disrupted by warfare, technical failures, or even deliberate attack. That's why modern navigation doesn't rely solely on GPS. We use multiple complementary systems. Europe has developed Galileo, its own satellite navigation system. Russia operates GLONASS. China has Beidou. India is building Navic. Modern receivers can use signals from all these systems simultaneously, providing better accuracy and more reliability. If one system has problems, others are still working. There's also growing interest in alternative navigation technologies that don't depend on satellites at all. Scientists are developing quantum sensors that use the bizarre properties of quantum mechanics to detect the tiniest changes in motion and rotation. These could eventually provide navigation systems that work anywhere, even in space, without requiring any external signals. Enhanced inertial navigation systems using ultra-precise accelerometers and gyroscopes can provide accurate positioning when satellite signals are unavailable. And here's something that surprised me when I learned it. Even celestial navigation isn't completely obsolete. The U.S. Naval Academy stopped teaching celestial navigation in the 1990s, figuring that GPS had made it unnecessary. But in 2015, they resumed instruction. Why? Because GPS could be disrupted in warfare, and naval officers need backup skills. The ancient art of navigating by the stars, developed over thousands of years, remains relevant today as an emergency capability. Modern navigation stands on the shoulders of everyone I've told you about in this video. The Phoenicians, who first ventured beyond the sight of land and proved humans could cross open oceans. The Polynesian wayfinders, who developed techniques so sophisticated that we're still trying to fully understand them. The instrument makers who gave us astrolabes, quadrants, and sextants. Prince Henry the Navigator, who organized exploration scientifically and turned it into a systematic discipline. John Harrison, who solved the impossible problem of longitude through sheer determination and brilliant engineering. And countless others, astronomers, mathematicians, cartographers, sailors, and engineers, who each contributed pieces to the puzzle. Their collective legacy is a world where no one needs to be lost, where precise position is instantly available to everyone, and where the terrible maritime disasters of the past are largely preventable. We live in an age of navigational abundance that our ancestors couldn't have possibly imagined, made possible by centuries of human ingenuity, courage, and persistence. Every time you check your location on your phone, you're benefiting from thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and innovation. That little blue dot showing where you are represents the combined efforts of countless brilliant minds across centuries. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. We've journeyed together through thousands of years of navigation history. We started with ancient sailors reading the sun and stars, terrified of open water but brave enough to venture out anyway. We met the Phoenicians, who turned the Mediterranean into a highway of commerce and knowledge. We sailed with the Polynesian wayfinders, who read ocean swells and bird migrations to cross the largest ocean on Earth without any instruments. We watched as humanity developed increasingly sophisticated tools, the astrolabe, the quadrant, the sextant, each one expanding our ability to know where we are. We met Prince Henry the Navigator, who didn't sail himself but made all future sailing possible by organizing knowledge and pushing exploration forward systematically. We struggled alongside John Harrison through decades of work, rejection, and perseverance until he finally solved the longitude problem that had stumped the greatest minds of his age. And we've arrived here, in the present day, where navigation technology that would seem like magic to sailors from just a century ago is so commonplace that we barely notice it. We can know our exact position anywhere on Earth, instantly, using devices we carry casually in our pockets. But our journey together doesn't have to end here. If you found this story fascinating, if you love learning about the people, inventions, and breakthrough ideas that shaped our world, then I need you to do two important things right now. First, hit that subscribe button. Seriously, click it right now. I create videos like this one regularly, exploring the incredible stories of human achievement, scientific breakthroughs, historical turning points, and the brilliant minds who changed everything. There are so many more stories to tell. Stories about the people who figured out how to fly, how to split the atom, how to decode DNA, how to build computers. Stories about the moments when everything changed, when impossible became possible. And I don't want you to miss a single one. Second, and this is just as important, leave a comment down below. Tell me what surprised you most in this video. Was it the sophistication of Polynesian wayfinding? The fact that the Phoenicians might have circumnavigated Africa 2,000 years before Europeans did? John Harrison's 40-year struggle for recognition? The realization that GPS has only been fully operational for about 30 years? Or maybe you have questions about something I covered. Maybe you want to know more about a particular navigator or invention. Maybe you have suggestions for future videos. I read every single comment, and your engagement doesn't just help me understand what content resonates with you. It helps this channel grow and reach more people who share our curiosity about the world. Here's the thing. Navigation is ultimately about finding your way, about knowing where you are and where you're going. And right now, you're helping navigate this channel's journey. Your subscription, your like, your comment. These aren't just meaningless clicks. They matter. They tell YouTube's algorithm that this content is valuable, that people want to learn about history and science and human achievement. They help us reach viewers who might never have found this content otherwise. People who are just as curious as you are, but don't yet know this channel exists. Think about it this way. The navigators we talked about today, the Phoenicians, the Polynesians, Harrison, they all pushed humanity forward by sharing knowledge. They didn't keep their discoveries secret. They taught others, passed on their techniques, built on each other's work. That's how progress happens. And you're part of that same tradition. By engaging with educational content, by subscribing to channels that teach and inspire, by leaving comments that create community and discussion, you're helping to navigate us all toward a more knowledgeable, more curious, more connected world. So please, take just 5 seconds right now, click that subscribe button, tap the like, and leave a comment, even if it's just a few words about what you found most interesting. You'll be supporting more content like this, and you'll be joining a community of curious, engaged people who believe that understanding our past helps us navigate our future. I want to thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. I know it was long, but I hope you found it worthwhile. I hope you learned something new, felt inspired by these incredible stories of human determination and brilliance, and maybe gained a new appreciation for the technology we so often take for granted. The men who taught the world to navigate didn't do it for fame or recognition. Many of them, like Harrison, barely received any during their lifetimes. They did it because they were driven by curiosity, by the desire to solve problems, by the need to push beyond what was known into what was possible. That spirit of exploration and innovation is what made our modern world possible. And that same spirit is what drives channels like this one and viewers like you who seek out knowledge and understanding. So thank you for being here. Thank you for learning with me. Thank you for being curious about the world and the amazing humans who shaped it. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore another incredible chapter in the human story. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep navigating toward knowledge.